Hi, welcome to our first part of the recorded lectures. I had to break this one up into two. I had to break the recording up into two parts because it takes a long time to convert this to video. Um, but this is going to be the second part of our lecture on Chapter 12. The third part is another recording which comes after this. And this follows directly from the in-class lecture where we talked about the causes of the financial crises around the world and what they entail. There are two main causes, and we're going to look at first an example of some of those causes in action, and then talk about what kind of precautions you could take in order to avoid these types of crises. And then we'll move on after this one, discussing some reforms that that could happen. But first, let's talk about an example of these crises. Remember that there's two main causes of financial crises, and the first one had to do with macroeconomic imbalances, and the second cause is volatile capital flows. The Mexican peso crisis had components of both. Although the macroeconomic imbalances in Mexico at the time weren't all bad. Remember, there were several components or several examples of a macroeconomic imbalance. The first one was a budget deficit, where governments are just spending too much and they have to borrow to cover that spending. Mexico was not doing that. They had a fiscally responsible government that was able to pay for their spending with the taxes that they brought in. So Mexico had sound government spending policies and taxation policies at the time. Their imbalance came from their development policies. Mexico, coming out of the 70s and 80s, was somewhat of a developing economy, and they were emerging into becoming middle income as far as the globe is concerned, and they have, after this crisis, continue to grow and are now kind of upper middle income. Definitely a very strong growth economy, although they're not, where we're at, but they keep going, they'll get there. But in the strong growth kind of started during this period, and it is the strategy though that caused a macroeconomic imbalance. And the one that they had wasn't deficits; it had to do with the current account deficit. So it wasn't their budget deficits; it was the current account deficit. So remember, the current account deficit has to do with net exports, and they were importing more than they were exporting. But remember, the current account deficit also has to do with the financial account. The only way you're able to import more than export is by attracting international finance. And that's what Mexico was doing. Their government wasn't borrowing. Their private sector was. And a lot of individuals and companies from across the globe were investing into Mexico. There's large capital inflows into Mexico. This was part of President Salinas' policies. He was seen as a very successful president over this period. It was a pretty long period, 88 to 94, but saw Mexico emerging, into NAFTA and becoming a strong middle-income country. So Salinas' policies were to attract foreign capital, either directly in the form of, say, Ford building a factory in El Paso, or not El Paso, that would be Texas. Juarez is on the other side of El Paso, though. And there's quite a few manufacturing sectors there. And they would set up these export-oriented processing facilities, so these maquiladoras. And some of those are funded with financial inflows from abroad. And then there's portfolio investments where people were buying stocks and bonds in Mexico and allowing Mexican companies to build these factories themselves. So this was a largely successful policy and continued afterwards, but it built up an account deficit. And Mexican growth was really dependent on these inflows, these foreign inflows of capital. They didn't have the savings there domestically at home to be able to lend to these businesses and allow them to grow. So it was coming from abroad, um, and they were dependent upon it. Although it was, some of the problems came from other parts of the world. In 94, international investors started to get a little skittish about what they were doing. They wanted to look for some safe havens, more stable investments, things that carried less risk. The U.S. government had made interest rate adjustments that had caused some problems with banks. There were some bank failures in the United States also at this time. The savings and loan crises occurred earlier in the 90s. So this was coming out of the 91, 92 recession, and people were looking for safe havens for their cash. Mexico was not going to be one of those anymore. And this was made even worse by political events that were happening in Mexico. There's the Chiapas revolt, so in southern Mexico. There are groups of more indigenous people who are separatists and still to this day actually would like to separate from Mexico. But during this time period, the conflict had really flared up, and they were trying to secede from Mexico. There was violence. It was a violent revolt. This makes investors very nervous. As part of this political turmoil, the leading candidate for the Mexican presidency was assassinated in 94. So these events and the global climate made it so that the inflows of capital in Mexico were slowing and not going to be able to grow the economy like. So this led to overvalued currency. And so here we start getting steps towards the capital volatility side of this cause of the crisis. But we saw that the macroeconomic balances, the trade imbalances, were part of it too. So the Mexican currency began to become overvalued when investors started to sell Mexican financial assets. So we saw last class that when you sell these financial assets, you increase the supply of this currency, the peso. You need to sell these assets and you get pesos, but you would like to get out of those pesos and get into your home country's currency. So you increase the supply. That will cause the peso to devaluate, or at least not devaluate yet, but it will put downward pressure on the peso. Now, the Mexican Central Bank had been fixing their exchange rate, so they had to work even harder to keep it at the level it was in the face of this increased supply. They had to be able to demand those pesos out of the market and in exchange for some of the other foreign currency reserves, such as dollars or any other of the major currencies. And they had to take these actions using their reserves of foreign currency to be able to balance the things out and keep the peso stable. This was tough to do. Investors began to feel that they can't do this forever. You're going to run out of foreign currency. You're going to run out of these international currencies soon enough. And it became clear that there needed to be a devaluation. The peso needed to depreciate against foreign currencies. Finally, in 1994, the new president, Ernesto Zedillo, so a new president, investors waiting for this individual to show that they know how to run the government. He came out with a 15% reduction in the peso. Investors were expecting much higher, twice that much. So this was a sign of somebody who would do what's right, but didn't really understand the gravity of the situation and how much they needed to devalue the currency. It showed a certain level of incompetence, at least in the eyes of the investors. So this led to even further capital flight and, of course, even further depreciation, especially once they moved to a pure floating exchange rate system. Mexico had pressure to do this as part of becoming part of NAFTA. You needed to free up your currencies and move to a floating system like the U.S. and like Canada. They went ahead and did that, and when they allowed the forces of supply and demand to set the exchange rate, well, the exchange rate became even less favorable for Mexican currency holders, and anything priced in Mexican financial assets became even less valuable. So the peso continues to collapse. Eventually, they had to appeal to NAFTA, IMF, and get some assistance there. And once they did, it recovered in '95, and there was solid growth afterwards. But this period of time was tough. And but it's a good example of how these macroeconomic imbalances, the trade imbalance, which leads to imbalances in the financial account, can combine with exchange rate poor exchange rate policies, and exchange rate crises that lead to capital flight. So we mentioned in the beginning of this lecture how common these things were, and they had become more common with the higher level of financial integration. And people are trying to study how to avoid these now. We saw with the Mexican peso crisis, what happened was NAFTA and the IMF come in and essentially bail Mexico out. Now, bailouts involve large loans that you float to somebody who's in trouble to get them out of trouble. And it allows them to avoid certain negative consequences. There's a lot of pressure to do this because you want to stabilize the international economy. Mexico's economic collapse was bringing down all of Latin America. So people want to fix things because it's good for them if there's stability elsewhere. The problem is, what kind of incentives do you give people if they can anticipate and expect to be bailed out? And that's where we talk about moral hazard. So with moral hazard, you have to start to ask yourself, have past responses helped encourage risky behavior? Does a bailout in the possibility of a bailout mean that people are willing to experiment more than they should, or take more risks than they should? This is a legitimate question. We apply these to banks and countries who believe that they'll get a bailout, and they'll take more risk. With moral hazard, there is something a little more complicated. If somebody's taking risks and there's investors who see that, the investors should be smart enough to realize that this is excessive risk that a country's taking, or this is bad policies. These are bad policies. So the source of money that is being used and be provided to the risk takers should be limited. The problem is with information. When there's information lacking, this can lead to a crisis. So sometimes you hear moral hazard, applied to situations in which somebody goes to get health insurance and they want to withhold information from the insurer about them being an avid downhill skier who smokes 5 packs of cigarettes a day. That's probably not good information you want for someone to give to their health insurance provider, because you're going to pay a lot. So that's the idea of moral hazard here. These individuals will take risks, but they're not going to tell people how risky they are. So they'll limit that information. When information is limited, they'll be able to attract more investment than they should, and that can really accelerate the size of things and the scale of things and lead to a crisis. So one thing that people have suggested is to have banks and the owners of banks, the stakeholders and the shareholders, have capital in direct ownership in the bank, and have parts of the bank that they directly own, because there are ways that say that the legal owner has very little stake. Well, they will legally own it, but it will be financed by other sources, so that they're essentially a small part of the ownership structure, even though that they are probably able to make decisions and lead the institution. And so the more the owners, or at least the decision makers, have equity, then the less likely they are to risk the entire company. So as long as these owners are actually own the physical capital, it's not being financed by some other source, and that their earnings are being retained in the company and being reinvested in the company, as opposed to being taken and put into some offshore account somewhere. Then they have stake in that company, and if it goes under, they lose their earnings and their past earnings. So the more you can tie up their past earnings into it, then the less risk they'll take that could cause them to lose the entire company. Otherwise, if you've gotten what you wanted out of a company and could care less if it kept on existing, why not just take as many risks as possible and get what you can now and get out? So capital requirements will limit that incentive. So there's been more capital requirements required internationally by what's called the Basel Accords. So Basel III was in 2010. This came after the 2007-2009 recession, because the idea with a lot of the cause there had to do with the ability to take loans, issue loans, and then flip them. So you had zero equity in any of these investments. You had no capital requirement in any of these investments. I could issue you a mortgage, say thank you, I'm going to collect some fees, and then I'm going to turn around and sell this mortgage to somebody else and let them worry about it. The Basel Accords make that a little bit more difficult in theory. Things are still open, and there's a debate as to how efficient and how well they will work. I guess is something we'll see in the future. Another thing that you might want to avoid, or countries might want to avoid, is a crawling peg. So this type of exchange rate policy is a bad idea. So let me describe what a crawling peg is, and then try and describe how it's a bad idea. The crawling pegs, what these are designed to do is to keep a country in the game of international trade of goods and services, in the face of the fact that their prices are rising, and there's quite a bit of inflation there. So if prices are rising in your home country, then that has an impact on the real exchange rate, meaning that individuals' purchasing power is going to be lower. So this includes individuals abroad. So if there's somebody from the United States trying to buy, land or capital in Mexico, and Mexico's land prices and prices in general are increasing, it's going to be more costly for someone in the United States to be able to buy those types of investments. So with a crawling peg, you try to offset that a little bit. So this isn't really math, this is more illustrative math. We've already looked at this before, but this is the real exchange rate. This is our equation for the real exchange rate. So what we're looking at here is R sub r, little r. That's the real exchange rate. It's equal to the nominal exchange rate times the ratio of prices here, where this is the P star is the foreign price, and then P is the domestic price level. So these are price levels, just in this instance. And with these price levels, so these are the average prices in the entire economy, we could say, okay, if there's inflation, our domestic price levels increasing, so the average prices of the entire economy are increasing, and then this ratio is falling, right? It's as if we're moving from 1/2 to 1/4 here. 1/4 is a smaller number than 1/2. So that ratio is going to be falling. The implications for the real exchange rate, if nothing happened with that nominal exchange rate right there, that R sub n, if nothing happens with that, the implications are that the real exchange rate falls, and what this means is that there's going to be a domestic real exchange rate appreciation. So the domestic's going to be buying more, but conversely, foreigners are not going to be able to buy as much domestic goods and services. So your exports are going to fall, and your imports are going to rise. It's going to make your trade balance worse, right? If everyone's buying a lot of imports and you're not able to export anything, mainly because your prices are increasing. So what you can do to offset that is to make these crawling adjustments. So here's this crawling peg to your nominal exchange rate. So your domestic prices are increasing. This causes a fall in the real exchange rate, meaning that your domestic purchasing power is increasing. You're buying more abroad, but people can't buy your stuff. So what you do to make it easier for people to buy your stuff is to cause your currency to depreciate. So you make these slow crawling adjustments to R sub n. You increase R sub n here so that the foreign currency is appreciating. The foreign currency is going to be able to buy more domestic currency, but meanwhile your domestic currency is depreciating. This offset things. What happens sometimes is that the central bank will try to also use this policy to slow down the inflation at home. And so if you have this crawling peg, so you're letting your currency depreciate a little bit, sometimes a little bit like each day. They'll do it daily. This leads to this kind of domestic appreciation. If you do that by less, so if you're going to depreciate your currency by a little bit less than the amount that prices are increasing, well, this tends to slow inflation. You're going to allow imports to compete still. Imports are going to be able to come in. Your country's going to be able to afford these imports. And so your domestic businesses are going to face that competition, and they'll have to keep their prices competitive. They won't be able to increase their prices because otherwise they're going to lose business to these imports that you're able to bring in. But in the end, as you're not devaluating your currency enough, so you can lead to overvaluation of it, and people are going to expect depreciation in the future. And so that's the important part, is that if you're not increasing your nominal currency fast enough to fully offset these price increases, so you're not devaluating your currency enough so that R sub n is not increasing fast enough, meaning you're not devaluing your currency fast enough, well, that leads to trouble, and people will expect you to devalue your currency eventually, and they'll start to pull out their money. And the same thing will lead to an exchange rate crisis. So this crawling peg idea, especially if you're not devaluing your currency enough, you're just doing it just enough to offset some of the price increase at home, well, it leads to trouble. Okay, so that's the end of this first section, and I'm going to start the second section right now. You can start it when you want. I'll talk to you later.